Hi, everyone. My name is Dante Gonzalez. My pronouns are he and they. I am a theater arts student, and my presentation today is called The Language of Intimacy, Desexualized Language in Consent-Based Performance, and I'll explain all of those words in just a minute. And I would like to take a moment to thank my advisor, Dr. Leahy, who is joining electronically, and my friends and family who are here today, as well as my 5 interview participants who helped collaborate on this project. My presentation does mention sexuality in a fictional context, so feel free to take the time and space you need with these subjects. And so I'll begin. Let's talk about sex. How do you do that? And how do you do it in a professional setting where you need to create the illusion of sexual intimacy, and you also need to hit that specific mark so that the gaffer can hit that lighting cue really well? And how do you begin to bridge the gap between the two when you're talking about an artistic story versus a professional environment versus a stage or a set? How do you begin to do that? So when I began this project, I started asking these questions myself. I began with a review of the pre-existing literature in the field, which is a little bit new, and then I am going to walk you through today how my research process went, my interview process, and then I'll talk a bit about what I've discovered and how I think that might apply in the future. So, intimacy direction is a term used to describe the art of choreographing movement to depict or create the illusion of sexual intimacy on stage, both in theater contexts, film contexts, TV, etc. And so this is usually sexual intimacy, which is sort of my focus for this project. So the question at the heart of this field of intimacy direction is, how do you responsibly create choreography for sexual stories and also protect actors and performers when there's such a strong power dynamic between directors, producers, writers, and actors, etc.? So to give a sort of clearer picture as to what that choreography might look like in a room, instead of a director saying, go ahead and kiss passionately, which isn't a very clear direction, an intimacy choreographer might say to close the distance between your mouths on a 1 count, hold there for 4 counts, and then draw away on a 2 count. So really getting specific numbered choreography, similar to dance. So what happens when you're not talking about people's mouths and kissing, but something a little bit more sexually explicit in a scene? How do you begin to navigate that sort of treacherous environment? So there's a few different schools of thought on how to do that. One intimacy organization might argue that all the language needs to be as desexualized or even clinical as possible, and then another organization might say that the most commonly used term for a sexual act or position is acceptable and is neutral enough in a rehearsal environment. So I wanted to find out with this interview process what intimacy directors themselves say as opposed to the organizations who train them, and how did actors and directors perceive this language in those rooms. So does a clinical approach to language yield more safe and more consensual results? Or when is a word so specific and medical that it's not accessible to actors and they don't even know what you're talking about? When is the word but inappropriate? And when is gluteus maximus not acceptable? So in this field, because it is relatively new and based in a physical medium of choreography and performance, there aren't a lot of written resources, but I did supplement my own learning process by attending a workshop. I'm sorry, I'm stepping off the block. By attending an in-person workshop, which is how most of the trainings happen in the field. That's how they share their knowledge. I did also read some of the literature which is available, including the book Staging Sex, which is sort of the industry standard guide for how to approach intimacy direction and intimate topics in theater and film. I then interviewed 5 people. I interviewed 4 intimacy choreographers / directors who work in both theater and film. Most of them did both. Some of them concentrated more on theater or film. And then I also interviewed one director/actor who had experiences both as an actor and a director with intimacy direction. So I wanted to get a fairly broad view of the field within the limited scope of my project. I also, in these interviews, asked a series of questions about their experiences with the language in particular, and I tailored each interview to each person's experiences as a choreographer/actor/director. And with their collaboration, I have written a academic paper discussing the interviews and my findings and some of the background literature as a way for me to contribute to the sort of growing literature in the field. So after transcribing and doing some analysis of these interviews, I highlighted some themes that emerged. So these include the names of body parts, the names of sexual positions, and the names of sexual acts, and the different words that people use to talk about them. So I looked for the relationship between these different languages and also the different parties who are using them. So how do choreographers and actors talk together using this language? I also found that when there was a misalignment between the different languages used, it was usually due to social scripts surrounding that term, which I'll get into a little bit later. So for some examples of what I found, in my third interview, the choreographers spoke about how our ideas of sexuality as a larger society are predicated on heteronormative ideas. And so even beyond that, on a gender dynamic level, men, especially men of color, are equated with violence and dominance, and women, particularly white women, are associated with victimhood and the need for protection. And this doesn't always serve us in storytelling. This isn't always the story we're trying to tell, and sometimes that can get in the way. So in this interview in particular, the choreographer spoke about how even the commonly used names of sexual acts reinforce these ideas and aren't useful artistically. So she specifically used the example of the term pegging, which is a term used to distinguish straight male partners receiving penetration from gay male partners receiving penetration. And so this is a very loaded term that has a specific gender, sexuality, and narrative attached to it. So as a form of shorthand, it isn't useful as an artistic tool because it already has all of these elements associated with it. So this term, if it's being used in a scene that's being choreographed, is doing directors and actors a disservice. But in another example, in my fifth interview, we spoke about how the choreographer was on set and trying to not use the commonly used term for a sexual position and sort of tried to describe where the legs should go, how the movement would work, and the actors were confused and sort of staring blank-eyed, and then the other actor leaned over and said, "Missionary." And then the other actor goes, "Oh, I know what that means." So there are two things that can be true here. There is real denotations and connotations to the slang terms used for sexual acts that aren't necessarily helpful in an intimacy context, and also they're not inclusive to people who have alternate experiences, who don't experience sexuality in a heteronormative or cisgendered way. And also, by using ways to get around that language or more medical language, choreographers risk alienating the actors who are there trying to help. So I would propose instead that the neutral language of most commonly used slang isn't typically neutral and isn't always artistically effective. So here are some thoughts that I will leave you with. The approach to intimacy direction as proposed by the organizations of a strict and clear example of what language can and cannot be used isn't effective, but each individual choreographer that I spoke with had their own ways of navigating each context that was effective. And so the training and soft skills that they received were helpful in the rehearsal room, but the organization's specific lists of this is okay to say and this is not okay to say wasn't as effective. I also found that there was less conflict about the language in the rehearsal room when they used that language, and that overall the actors and directors received it really well. So in closing, I think that these techniques in the field are helpful within and outside of the rehearsal room whenever we're speaking about sex or sensitive subjects. And I think that by modeling this in other areas, we can not only have better and more thoughtful conversations, but also make great art. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It's been nice to see your project evolve since we were conceptualizing them together. I had a question. I know that we're all pressed for time with these short presentations. You had a note about gender and like the language around somebody's chest. And I wonder if you could talk about the experience of gender diverse performers, maybe playing roles that don't align with their own identity, or maybe anything that came about in your interviews that is relevant to that subject.
Yes, and I put it on the slideshow because it came up a lot, and I'm going to speak about it much more in my paper. For a bit of context and transparency, I am a trans artist, and every one of my participants knew that when we came into the interview. And while I didn't explicitly ask about transgender performers, every single one of the choreographers brought it up independently. And they all spoke about how, specifically in terms of the language we use for body parts, transgender performers typically sort of fall outside of the bounds of what is protected language and what is the sort of typical language that we use about people's bodies. And so in the field of intimacy direction, when we're speaking about people's chests in particular, the sort of like upper torso region, the organizations will put forward that chest is a neutral term and that it is universally applicable. Everybody has a chest. But for some actors, specifically trans actresses, that isn't accessible language. It's too masculine. And so in my paper, I'll discuss more about what language is considered neutral is usually aligned with the masculine and defeminizes transgender performers as well as cis women performers. And so I had two separate interviewers both speak about how the term breasts should be accepted and not considered a sexualized and inappropriate language, especially when we're talking about intimacy direction and sexual scenes. Yeah.
This is so interesting, thank you. And knowing a bit about you just as an artist and as someone who is also themselves a playwright, do you have any experience with this firsthand as being part of the creative process? Versus coming at it from this more academic lens, and do you have anything to say about the creative side and your experience with that?
Yeah, I have a bit of experience as a playwright and sort of writing intimate scenes, but that has come sort of after my education in intimacy direction. And I think that how that's affected my writing is that I'm actually more vague than I probably would be, or I'll put in a caveat that this is probably a kiss, but it could probably be something else. So like, depending on the accessibility of the actors, et cetera, I'm trying to get across the story that I'm trying for, but I'm also, I think, probably more open-minded about what intimacy could look like on stage. In terms of my experiences with intimacy direction and choreography itself, I've done a little bit of training to sort of build up to be able to be an intimacy choreographer, and I found that in rehearsal rooms where I am sort of running the intimacy choreography, I'm focused first and foremost on where the story intersects with the actors' comfort levels. And so like, working with my peers, because I know them fairly well, I can sort of gauge when they are and aren't comfortable and sort of navigate that field, and also work with the director, who's also usually a peer, to sort of figure out what story we're trying to tell.
Thank you, Dante, for this presentation. You mentioned that the sort of other soft skills that intimacy directors have beyond sort of memorizing lists of appropriate words are more useful in the rehearsal room. Can you say more about what some of those other soft skills are that they sort of bring to the table?
Yeah, I think, and this is actually paired with vocabulary, this soft skill of finding vocabulary to talk about and codify movement. So in different intimacy choreography practices, they will use different words to describe the movements being used by actors. And I found that the choreographers often had to code switch between talking with actors versus speaking with stage managers. So speaking with actors, they will say, move in this sort of way energetically using movement words that come from different choreography practices like Laban. You could make a gliding motion, but that isn't specific enough for a stage manager to look at and say, this is happening on stage. Whereas if you say to a stage manager, they're going to close on a count of 4 and then open on a count of 3, a stage manager can look and count. And so there's a bit of back and forth there. And then you add on, when there's any sort of contracts involved, you add on the language of being able to speak with actors versus directors versus stage managers versus legal language of being able to describe what exact body part is being shown in a nude scene. And so there's lots of different ways that they have to engage socially with different kinds of people. Thank you.